The winter gave her one day. She built a living hallway. Abel Rusk, who had survived 9 Dakota winters and buried a wife to the cold, told her, "If you cut that wall, that boy will freeze before morning." She had $18, one 6-year-old, and 4 cords of wood she could not cut. On October 15th, 1880, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. But 4 months earlier, Clara Hensley Vale had never altered a cabin wall. She had arrived in Dakota Territory in June of 1880 with blistered hands and a dead man's debt. Clara Hensley Vale knew how to feed chickens. She knew how to gather eggs without cracking them, how to spot a broody hen, how to tell when a rooster was more trouble than he was worth. Back in southern Indiana, her father had kept a flock behind the farmhouse, and Clara had worked it from the time she could carry a bucket. But building things, actual structures with walls and joints and purpose, that had always been Jonah's work. Jonah had been the one who read diagrams. Jonah had been the one who understood why a stud needed to sit just so, why a roof pitch mattered, why you chinked with lime and not just mud. Jonah was dead now. He had died in May, 200 miles east of the claim, pinned beneath a freight wagon that had slipped its brake on a grade outside Huron. The axle had caught him across the chest before anyone could move. Clara had not been there. She had been in Yankton, waiting with Eli, watching the road for a man who would never come back. The news arrived by letter. The body did not arrive at all. What arrived instead was the debt. $43 owed for lumber, stovepipe, and filing fees. The lumber sat on a half-built claim 7 miles southeast of De Smet. The stovepipe sat in crates beside it. The filing fees had bought them nothing but the right to fail on soil that did not yet belong to them. Clara had 2 choices. She could abandon the claim and lose everything Jonah had paid toward it, every dollar, every board, every hour of labor that had killed him. Or she could go west and try to hold the land through winter. She chose west. The claim looked worse than the letter had described. Clara stood at the edge of the property in late June with Eli's hand in hers and 31 hens clucking in their travel crates behind her. The shack rose from the grass like something half swallowed by the earth. 16 feet by 18 feet, Jonah had written, tar-papered on 2 sides, ready for finishing by August. It was not ready for anything. The north wall had warped where green cottonwood had shrunk in the spring heat. Gaps showed between the boards wide enough to slide a hand through. The roof sod was thin over the back corner, patchy in a way that promised leaks. Only 2 walls had been chinked with mud, and even that mud had cracked and fallen in places. The door hung crooked. The single window had no glass, just oiled paper that had torn in one corner and flapped in the wind. 12 feet from the shack sat the chicken coop, if it could be called that. Jonah had built it from mixed pine planks and salvaged wagon slats, a low structure barely tall enough for Clara to crouch inside. The roof was sound, at least. The walls were tight. He had known that the birds mattered. But between the coop and the cabin there was nothing, just 12 feet of open prairie grass and a distance that might as well have been a mile when the winter came. Clara did not know that yet. She did not know what 12 feet meant in a blizzard. She did not know what 40 below meant when you had to cross open ground to check whether your hens had frozen on their roosts. She would learn. Eli tugged at her hand. "Mama, where do we sleep?" "Inside," Clara said. "We sleep inside." She did not say, "I do not know if inside will be enough." The first visitor came 3 days later. Clara was on the roof, scraping away dead sod and trying to judge how much new material she would need, when a man on a gray horse came up the track from the east. He rode slowly, the way men ride when they are not in a hurry and not impressed by what they see. He stopped at the edge of the property and sat there, watching her work. Clara climbed down. She had learned already that you did not ignore visitors on the prairie. There were too few of them, and each one carried news or judgment or both. "Mrs. Vale?" the man said. "Yes." "Abel Rusk." He did not dismount. "I knew your husband, helped him dig the privy hole back in April." Clara waited. Abel Rusk was 58 years old, though he looked older. His face had been carved by wind into something that resembled tree bark, deep grooves, weathered color, no softness left. He had buried a wife in the second winter on his own claim and an infant son in the third. He had rebuilt his barn twice after prairie fires, and once after a twister that had touched down close enough to take the roof but not the walls. He had survived 9 Dakota winters, and that fact sat on him like a weight that was also a credential. "I heard what happened to Jonah," Abel said. "I am sorry for it." "Thank you." "I came to see how you're getting on." He said it flat, the way a man says something when he already knows the answer and is not asking out of hope. Clara gestured at the shack, the coop, the stacks of unsplit wood, the single milk cow that had gone dry on the journey and now stood useless in a makeshift pen. "Getting on," she said. "Slowly." Abel dismounted then. He tied his horse to the fence post Jonah had set and walked the property without asking permission. Clara followed, watching him count and measure with his eyes the way she had seen her father count livestock, quick, accurate, already tallying the losses. He checked the cabin walls. He pressed his thumb into the chinking and watched it crumble. He looked at the north wall gap and shook his head once, a small motion that said more than cursing would have. He walked to the woodpile. It sat in a rough stack beside the cabin, maybe a cord and a half of mixed cottonwood and oak, some of it green, some of it split, most of it neither. "How much have you got?" Abel asked. Jonah said a cord and a half before he left. "Looks like less now. Some of this has been sitting wet. It will burn poor." He kicked at a piece of green cottonwood. "Where is the rest?" "The rest?" Abel turned to look at her. His eyes were the color of old iron. "Mrs. Vale, you need 5 cords minimum for a Dakota winter. 6 if it goes hard. 6 if you want to be sure." He pointed at the pile. "That is maybe 1.5. Some of it will not burn worth a damn. You're short 4 cords at least." Clara felt something cold settle into her stomach, colder than the June wind. "I have $18. 4 cords, cut, hauled, and stacked runs about $25 if you can find someone to do it. More if you cannot." Abel walked to the cabin door and pushed it open. The crooked hinge screamed. "Your stove?" Inside, Jonah said it before he left. Abel looked at the stovepipe, the chimney hole, the way the firebox sat on its legs. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he walked back outside and looked at the coop. "How many birds?" 31. "That is too many for a coop that size. They will smother each other if it gets cold enough, and they pile." He squinted at the structure. "Or they will freeze if you vent it wrong and the damp gets in." "You know about damp?" Clara knew. She had watched her father lose half a flock one winter in Indiana when the coop had been sealed too tight and the moisture from the bird's breath had turned to ice on the walls, then dripped onto them as it melted. Wet chickens died. Everyone knew that. "I know about damp," she said. Abel nodded. He walked back to his horse and stood there for a moment, one hand on the saddle horn, looking at the claim as if he were reading a death notice. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "you have 1.5 cords of wood, maybe less. You have no horse fit to haul a sled. You have no money to hire a man. You have a boy who is too young to swing an axe and a widow's work waiting for you from now until the snow flies." He paused. "If you stay here through winter, you will need to cut, split, and stack 4 cords of wood on your own, while also chinkling that cabin, fixing that roof, and keeping those birds alive. The nearest timber worth hauling is 9 miles. You do not have a wagon." "I know," Clara said. "Do you?" Abel mounted his horse. He looked down at her, and for a moment something like pity crossed his face. But it was pity mixed with the certainty of a man who had seen too many failures to believe in miracles. "I have been on this prairie 9 winters," he said. "I have seen men stronger than your husband freeze in their beds because they ran out of fuel in February. I have seen children." He stopped. "I have seen what happens when the math does not work." "What would you have me do?" "Sell the birds. Burn the coop for fuel if you have to. Find family in town and winter with them. Come back in spring if you still want this land." "I have no family in town." Abel's expression did not change. "Then find charity. Find a church. Find something. He gathered his reins. Because if you try to winter here with what you have, Mrs. Vale, you will kill that boy. The cold will not care that you tried. The cold will not care that Jonah died. The cold takes what it takes. He turned his horse toward the track. Mr. Rusk, Clara said. He stopped. How much wood do you have? 7 cords, Abel said, and I have been stacking since April. He rode away without looking back. That night, Clara did not sleep. She lay on the straw tick Jonah had stuffed before he left, listening to Eli breathe beside her, and she counted. She counted the dollars she had left. She counted the wood in the pile. She counted the weeks until the first frost, the first hard freeze, the first blizzard that would seal them in and not let go until spring. The numbers did not work. Abel Rusk was right. The math was fatal. But there was no family in town. There was no charity that would take a widow with a 6-year-old and 31 chickens and a debt that followed her like a shadow. If she left the claim now, she lost everything: the land, the shack, the birds, every dollar Jonah had paid, every hope that had brought them west. If she stayed, she died. If she left, she disappeared. Clara lay in the dark and felt the walls press in around her. The north wall let in a draft that moved across her face like a cold finger. She could hear the chickens in the coop, that low murmur they made when they were settling, that sound that meant warmth and feathers and 31 small hearts beating in the dark. She thought about her father. He had kept chickens in Indiana, a flock of 40 or more in a coop behind the farmhouse. In winter, he had hung hides across the root cellar passage to slow the smoke draft and keep the cold from creeping into the stores. She remembered the way the air changed when you passed through those hides. One side cold, one side warmer. The passage itself a kind of throat that could be opened or closed. A throat, she thought. A passage that could be controlled. She thought about the coop. 12 feet from the cabin, low and tight, the way Jonah had built it. She had been inside that morning, gathering eggs before dawn, and she remembered the way the air had felt when she ducked through the door, warm, almost shockingly warm compared to the cabin. The birds were packed close, 31 of them on roosts barely big enough for 20, and their bodies threw heat the way a stove threw heat, constant and mindless and free. Free heat. Heat she did not have to cut or haul or buy. Clara sat up in the dark. The cabin was cold because the cabin was full of leaks and dead air and gaps that let the wind whistle through. The coop was warm because the coop was tight and the birds were many and their breath and bodies filled the space with warmth that had nowhere to go. What if the warmth had somewhere to go? What if she connected them? Not an open hole, that would be madness. A draft tunnel that would strip heat from both spaces and freeze everything faster. But a passage. A controlled passage. Something with a door, a flap, a way to let warm air move when she wanted it and stop it when she did not. The birds heated the coop, the stove heated the cabin. But the stove's heat was finite. It depended on wood she did not have. The birds' heat was constant. It depended on nothing but feed and life. If she could borrow from the coop when the cabin was coldest and return warmth to the coop when the stove was burning hottest, the two spaces could temper each other. It was insane. It was something no one had ever told her to do. It was something Abel Rusk would call a widow's panic, but the math of doing nothing was already fatal. What did she have to lose by trying something? Clara got up quietly, careful not to wake Eli. She lit the tallow candle on the shelf and found the stub of charcoal she used for marking. Then she went to the cabin wall, the south wall, the one nearest the coop, and she began to draw. In the morning, she told Eli what she was going to do. He did not understand. He was 6. But he understood that his mother had a plan, and that was enough. He helped her carry the measuring string to the coop and hold one end while she stretched it to the cabin wall. 12 feet. The distance was shorter than she had thought, shorter than it felt when you were crossing it in a blizzard. She could build a passage 12 feet long. She could roof it with canvas and tar paper. She could insulate it with straw. She could cut an opening in each wall, low enough to let warm air pool, high enough to let her crawl through if she needed to check the birds without going outside. The flap would be the key. A heavy flap, hide or canvas, weighted at the bottom so it would hang closed unless she pulled it open. That was how her father had controlled the root cellar passage, a hide flap that you could peg back for air or let fall for seal. She could do the same thing here. She was still sketching measurements in the dirt when Martha Bell came up the track. Martha Bell was 34 years old, a mother of 4, and the most practical woman within 10 miles of De Smet. Her husband, Thomas, worked a claim 3 miles north, a claim that had a real barn, a real well, and enough wood stacked to see them through 2 winters if they had to. Martha had come to check on the widow, the way neighbors checked on widows, half mercy, half curiosity, entirely judgment. She found Clara kneeling in the dirt between the cabin and the coop, drawing lines with a stick. "Mrs. Vale?" Clara looked up. "Mrs. Bell. Good morning." Martha looked at the lines. She looked at the cabin wall, where Clara had marked the opening with charcoal. She looked at the coop. Her face went through several expressions before settling on confusion. "What are you doing?" Clara stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees. She had decided, sometime in the night, that she would not apologize for the plan. She would explain it and let people think what they thought. "I am going to connect the cabin to the coop," she said. Martha blinked. "Connect them how?" "A passage, 12 feet long, 3 feet high, 2.5 feet wide, framed with fence rails, clad with canvas and tar paper, insulated with straw. A hide flap on the cabin side to control the airflow." Martha stared at her. "You are going to build a tunnel to your chicken coop." "A passage, not a tunnel." "Why in the name of—" Martha stopped herself. She was a church-going woman. "Why?" Clara explained. She explained about the warmth in the coop, the cold in the cabin, the fatal math of wood she did not have and could not get. She explained about her father's root cellar passage, about controlled airflow, about borrowing heat from one space to buffer another. She explained about the hide flap, the low cut, the way warm air pooled near the ground and could be directed if you knew how. Martha listened. Her face did not soften. "You are going to cut a hole in your cabin wall," Martha said, "to let chicken air into your house." "To let warm air in, controlled warm air." "Chicken air," Martha repeated. "Do you know what chicken air is, Mrs. Vale? It is damp. It is dust. It is the smell of manure and feathers and things that make children sick." She shook her head. "You have a boy in that cabin. You want to fill his lungs with coop air." "The flap controls it. I open it at night when the coop is warmest and the cabin is coldest. I close it during the day. The stove vents high, so fresh air is always moving through." "And what about foxes?" Martha cut in. "You connect your cabin to your coop. You give every predator in the county a path straight to your hens. 1 fox, 1 weasel, and you lose your flock in a night. Then where is your heat?" Clara had not thought about foxes. The cold certainty in her stomach grew heavier. "I can secure the passage," she said. "Board the ends. Put the flap on the cabin side where no animal can push through." "And what about your labor?" Martha stepped closer. Her voice was not cruel, but it was relentless. The voice of a woman who had survived 4 winters by never believing in shortcuts. "You want to spend days building this passage, days of cutting and hauling and nailing. Those are days you could spend gathering fuel, gathering food, preparing the cabin the right way, the way everyone else does it. Everyone else has more wood than I do. Then get more wood. With what money? What horse? What time?" Martha had no answer for that. She stood there, arms crossed, looking at Clara the way Abel Rusk had looked at her, with the certainty of someone who knew the odds. "It will not work," Martha said finally. "You will cut that wall, and you will freeze faster than you would have if you had left it alone. The cabin is already drafty. You want to make it draftier and fill it with chicken stink besides. The flap? The flap will blow open in the first hard wind. The passage will fill with snow. The damp will rot the wood. By January, you will have a dead coop, a frozen cabin, and a sick child." Martha's voice softened, but only slightly. "I am not saying this to be cruel, Mrs. Vale. I am saying it because I have seen women try desperate things, and I have seen what happens when desperate things fail. Clara looked at the charcoal marks on her cabin wall. She looked at the coop, 12 feet away, full of warmth she could not use. "What would you have me do?" she asked. Martha's answer was the same as Abel Rusk's. "Cull the flock, burn part of the coop for fuel, find someone in town who will take you in for winter. Come back in spring if you still want this." "There is no one in town." "Then find someone." Martha turned to leave. "I will not watch you kill that boy with a fool's gamble, Mrs. Vale. I have seen enough children die on this prairie." She walked back to her cart and drove away without looking back. The gossip started the next day. Clara did not know how word traveled so fast on a prairie where the nearest neighbor was 2 miles away, but it traveled. By the end of the week, people she had never met knew that the widow on the Vale claim was planning to build a tunnel to her chicken coop. They did not call it a passage. They called it a tunnel or a pipe, or, when they wanted to be cruel, a henhouse hallway. The laughter was not loud. It was not even always meant to be heard. But Clara heard it anyway, in the way people looked at her when she came to town, in the way conversations went quiet when she approached the store counter, in the way children stared and then looked away when their mothers hushed them. Silas Pritchard made sure the laughter spread. Silas owned the general store in De Smet. He was 42 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a face that had gone soft in the way of men who work indoors and profit from other people's labor. He also brokered claims on the side, buying up failing homesteads for cents on the dollar and selling them to newcomers who did not know any better. He had a cousin who wanted the acreage next to Clara's. If she failed, he would be there to pick up the pieces. He did not want her to succeed. Clara found this out on her 3rd trip to town, when she came to buy nails. She had gathered eggs for 3 days straight, selling them for 2 cents each to a woman who ran a boarding house, and she had enough now for a half-pound of nails and nothing else. She counted them out onto Silas's counter. 14 eggs worth of labor, converted to iron. Silas weighed the nails slowly. "Building something, Mrs. Vale?" "Yes." "Must be small." He smiled the way a cat smiles at a mouse. "A half-pound does not build much." "It builds enough." "Enough for what?" He leaned on the counter. "A dollhouse? A toy for the boy?" He looked at Abel Rusk, who was standing near the seed barrels, pretending not to listen. "I heard you are building something strange out there, something with chickens." Clara said nothing. "People are talking," Silas continued. "They say the widow is going to invite her hens into the bedroom. They say she is going to winter in the privy next if it saves a stick of wood." He laughed, and a few of the men near the stove laughed with him. "People who cannot afford wood invent foolishness, I suppose." "People who cannot afford wood find other ways to stay warm." "Other ways?" Silas's smile widened. "Is that what you're calling it? Other ways?" He pushed the nails across the counter. "Mrs. Vale, I have been on this prairie longer than you have been alive. I have seen 100 homesteaders come through here, and I have seen what happens to the ones who think they are smarter than the weather. They freeze. They starve. They come crawling back to this counter in February, begging for flour on credit, promising to pay in spring with money they will never have." "I will not be begging." "No?" He leaned closer. "When you cut that wall open and let your coop air into your cabin, when your birds freeze and your boy gets sick, when you realize that your clever little tunnel is nothing but a windpipe for the blizzard, you will be back, and I will be here, and the credit will cost you more than the pride you are spending now." Clara picked up the nails. They were cold in her hand, small and sharp and finite. She thought about what her father had told her once, about men who made their living from other people's failure. "Mr. Pritchard," she said, "do you know how much a hen is worth?" He blinked. "What?" "A hen. A laying hen. Do you know what she is worth?" $1, maybe. Less if she is old." $1 for the bird," Clara said. "But a laying hen gives you 5 eggs a week, maybe 6 if she is well fed and warm. That is 2 cents each. 10 cents a week, 40 cents a month. In 6 months, she has paid for herself twice over. In a year, she has paid for herself 4 times. Clara put the nails in her pocket. "And that is just the eggs." A hen in a closed space gives off heat, constant heat day and night, without being fed anything but scraps. 31 hens in a coop 12 feet from my cabin are not just eggs, Mr. Pritchard. They are a furnace I do not have to fuel. Silas's smile had faded. You can laugh, Clara said. You can spread whatever stories you want. But when winter comes, I will have 31 hens and a passage to control their warmth, and you will have nothing but gossip and a ledger full of debts you hope to collect from people who fail. She turned to leave. I do not plan to fail. She walked out before he could respond. Behind her, she heard him say something to the men by the stove, something that made them laugh again, but quieter this time, less certain. Abel Rusk said nothing at all. The next morning, Clara began to cut. She started with the cabin wall. The south wall, the one nearest the coop, the one Jonah had chinked most carefully because it faced the direction of the worst summer storms. She stood there with the saw in her hand, looking at the charcoal mark she had made, and she understood that this was the moment when she stopped being like everyone else. If she was wrong, she would die. If she was wrong, Eli would die. If she was wrong, Silas Pritchard would buy the claim for nothing and sell it to his cousin, and no one would remember Clara Hensley Vale except as an example of what happened when widows tried to think for themselves. She put the saw to the wood and pushed. The first cut was the hardest. The blade bit into the cottonwood planks and stuck almost immediately. The wood was warped and green in places, swollen where water had gotten in, and frozen over winter. Clara had to work the saw back and forth, leaning her weight into it, feeling the teeth catch and release, catch and release. By the time she had cut one side of the opening, her shoulders were screaming. Eli stood behind her, holding a bucket of water and a rag the way she had told him to. He was too young to understand what she was doing, but he understood that it was important. He understood that his mother was fighting something, and he wanted to help. "Mama," he said, "is that where the chickens will come in?" "Not the chickens," Clara said. "Just the air, just the warmth." "Will it smell?" She thought about Martha Bell's warning. Chicken air is damp. It is dust. It is the smell of things that make children sick. "Maybe a little," she said, "but we will be warm." She finished the first side and started on the second. The saw stuck worse here, catching on a knot she had not seen beneath the surface. She pushed harder, felt something give, and suddenly the blade broke through, not just through the board, but through her confidence too, because what she saw on the other side was not the gray light of the prairie. It was darkness. The wall was hollow. Jonah had built it with a gap between the inner and outer boards, probably for insulation, and Clara had just cut into that gap. The opening was bigger than she had planned, the edges ragged where the hidden boards had splintered. Her hands shook. She could fix this. She could brace the opening with extra wood. She could— "Mrs. Vale?" Clara turned. A man was walking up the track from the east, carrying a broad-bladed hatchet and an auger over his shoulder. He was old, 60 at least, maybe more, with a face as weathered as Abel Rusk's, but with something different in the eyes. Something that was not pity, something that looked almost like interest. "I am Niels Torgen Moen," the man said. He pronounced it Niels, with a long vowel and a softness at the end. "I live 4 miles north. I heard you were building something." "Everyone has heard," Clara said. "Yes." Niels stopped a few feet away and looked at the wall, at the ragged opening, at the saw in her hand. "Everyone has heard, but I came to see." He walked past her and studied the cut she had made. He pressed his fingers into the gap where the boards had splintered. He looked at the hollow space inside the wall, the place where insulation should have been and was not. "You found the void," he said. "I did not know it was there. Your husband built in a hurry. He left gaps." Niels pulled a sliver of wood from the edge of the opening and examined it. "The stud behind here is split. You see? The crack runs down from the top. If you cut wider, the whole frame will shift." Clara's stomach dropped. "What do I do?" Niels looked at her. He was not smiling, but he was not frowning either. His face was the face of a man who had seen problems before and did not panic at the sight of them. You sister a brace, he said. You cut a piece of oak the length of the stud, and you nail it alongside the split. The new wood takes the load, the old wood stays in place. He set down his hatchet and auger. I have oak in my wagon. I can show you. Why? The question came out sharper than Clara had intended. She was tired. She was scared. She had spent 3 days being told that what she was doing was insane, and now a stranger was offering to help, and she did not understand why. Niels considered the question. I watched you mark that wall from the track, he said. You measured before you cut. You marked the airflow height, not just a hole. You were thinking about where warm air pools and how to catch it. He nodded at the opening. That is not panic. That is design. Everyone says it is panic. Everyone did not see your measurements. Niels picked up his hatchet. I spent 40 years building in cold places, sheds, smokehouses, winter passages on farms in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and places colder than this. I know what a person looks like when they are thinking in channels. He looked at Clara, and for the first time something like respect crossed his face. You are thinking in channels, Mrs. Vale. I want to see if you are right. They worked until dark. Niels showed her how to sister the brace, cutting a length of oak from a broken wagon tongue Jonah had left behind, fitting it against the split stud, nailing it in place with the nails she had bought from Silas. The new wood was hard and dense, and it took the load the way Niels had said it would. The frame steadied. The opening held. He showed her how to cut the coop side too, placing the opening higher than the cabin side so that warm air rising in the coop would flow naturally toward the lower opening in the cabin. He explained it not as a lecture, but as a demonstration, holding the tallow flame near the gap to show how air moved, how smoke curled toward the lower pressure, how warmth sought the path of least resistance. Air is like water, Niels said. It flows downhill, it finds the gaps. You cannot fight it. You can only guide it. Clara watched. She learned. By evening, both openings were cut. The cabin wall gaped like a wound, cold prairie light pouring through. The coop wall had a matching hole, smaller and higher, neat as a picture frame. Between them was nothing, just 12 feet of grass and the promise of something that did not exist yet. Eli had fallen asleep on a pile of straw sacks. His face was dirty. His hands were scraped from gathering kindling. He had worked harder than any 6-year-old should work, and he had not complained once. Clara covered him with a blanket and stood in the doorway, looking at the holes she had made. You will need to frame the passage tomorrow, Niels said. He was gathering his tools, preparing to leave. I can bring more oak, fence rails, if you have none. I have some, not many. Then we use what you have and find the rest. He shouldered his auger. The frame goes up first, then the roof, then the sides, then the flap. He paused. The flap is the most important part. If it is too light, the wind will blow it open. If it is too heavy, you cannot adjust it. You need something you can control, something you can peg back when you want air and let fall when you do not. I have a calf hide, Clara said, from a calf that died on the journey. Niels nodded. That will do. We will weight the bottom with a rod. I have done this before, in root cellars and smokehouses. The principle is the same. He turned to leave, then stopped. Mrs. Vale, he said, the people who laugh at you have never built anything that was not in a book. They know the rules because someone told them the rules. They do not know why the rules are rules. He looked at her cabin, at the ragged opening, at the first step of something no one had told her to build. Sometimes the rules are wrong. Sometimes the only way to survive is to make a new rule. He walked into the darkness, and Clara stood alone with the cold wind blowing through the wall she had cut. The first night with the openings was brutal. Without the passage to connect them, the holes were just gaps, wounds in the cabin's skin that let the cold pour through like water through a broken dam. Clara stuffed them with straw and canvas, temporary patches that held the worst of it back, but could not stop the draft entirely. She fed the stove more than she wanted to, watching the woodpile shrink, counting the sticks the way a miser counts coins. Eli coughed in his sleep. A small cough, just once, but Clara heard it like a gunshot in the dark. She had to finish. She had to finish before the weather turned, before the coughs became fevers, before the gossip became prophecy. In the morning, she started the frame. The work was harder than cutting the walls. Fence rails had to be measured, notched, fitted into place. The first 2 rails went up crooked, and Clara had to tear them down and start again. Her hands bled through her gloves. Her back ached from bending. The sun moved across the sky too fast, mocking her progress, reminding her how little time she had. By noon, she had 1 side standing. By evening, she had 2 sides and part of the roof. The passage looked like a skeleton, bones without flesh, shape without substance. Niels came back at dusk with more oak and a bundle of tar paper he had traded for somewhere. He did not ask for payment. He worked beside her until the light failed, teaching as he worked, showing her how to lap the tar paper so rain would run off instead of seeping through, how to pack straw between the outer and inner cladding so wind could not comb it loose. "You're building this like a coffin," he said, and Clara flinched at the word. "That is a compliment. A coffin is tight. A coffin keeps the outside out." The next day, Martha Bell came back. She stood at the edge of the property watching Clara nail tar paper to the frame. Her face was unreadable. "It looks like a coffin," Martha said. "That is what Mr. Moen said." "He would know. He built my husband's mother's coffin 3 winters ago." Martha walked closer. She looked at the frame, the openings, the hide Clara had hung but not yet weighted. "Does it work?" "I do not know yet. The flap is not finished." Martha said nothing for a long moment. Then she reached into her cart and pulled out a bundle, old quilt batting, 2 onion sacks, a length of rope. "For the dead air gaps," she said. "Stuffing. The batting keeps warmth in. The sacks can hold straw where the batting runs out." Clara stared at her. "I thought you said this was fool's work." "I still think it is fool's work." Martha set the bundle on the ground. "But I will not let a child freeze because his mother was stubborn and I did nothing." She turned to leave. "You have 1 night to prove me wrong, Mrs. Vale. 1 night after that flap goes down. If the cabin is not warmer than it was before, you tear this thing apart and start doing what everyone else does." She drove away. Clara looked at the bundle, at the frame, at the sky, where the clouds had begun to stack in that heavy gray way that meant weather was coming. 1 night to prove it. 1 night to find out if the living hallway was salvation or suicide. She picked up the hammer and went back to work. The flap went down at dusk. Clara had worked through the afternoon without stopping, her fingers numb inside her gloves, her shoulders burning from the constant reach and pull of nailing. Niels had shown her how to weight the hide, a straight oak rod sewn into the bottom hem, heavy enough to make the flap hang closed, but light enough that she could lift it with 2 fingers. The rod came from a broken chair leg he had brought from his own cabin, sanded smooth so it would not catch on the frame. "Too light and the wind owns it," Niels said. "Too heavy and you cannot adjust. You want something that will settle, not slam." The hide was stiff from the curing, but it softened as Clara worked it, folding and unfolding, until it moved like cloth instead of board. She pegged it to the cabin-side frame with leather loops, 3 along the top, spaced so the hide could swing but not twist. The bottom rod hung straight. When she let go, the flap fell closed with a soft thump, sealing the passage from the cabin side. "Now we test," Niels said. He lit a tallow stub and held it near the base of the flap. The flame bent, barely, but visibly pulled toward the gap at the bottom where warm Coop air was already beginning to seep through. "You feel that?" Niels asked. Clara put her hand near the flame. The air was not warm exactly, but it was not the knife cold of the cabin's north wall. It was something between a softness, a buffer, a temperature that did not hurt to touch. "It is working," she said. "It is beginning to work. The true test comes tonight, when the stove is cold and the birds are roosting." Niels set down the tallow. "Do not open the flap wide, not yet. Let the warmth build in the passage first. Let the 2 spaces learn each other." He left before full dark. promising to return in the morning to check the seams. Clara stood alone in the cabin, watching the hide flap hang motionless in the lamplight, listening to the wind pick up outside. Eli was already in bed, his cough no worse than the night before, but no better either. Clara covered him with every blanket they had and lay down beside him, too tired to eat, too nervous to sleep. The stove burned low. The woodpile shrank by 3 sticks, then 4, then 5. Clara counted each one, watching the flames die down to coals, feeling the cabin cool around her like water filling a basin. At midnight, she got up and put her hand on the hide flap. The leather was not cold, it was not warm either, but when she lifted it just an inch, just enough to feel the air that came through was different, softer, heavier. It smelled of feathers and straw and the particular warmth of living things packed close together. She let the flap fall and went back to bed. In the morning, the water bucket had not frozen. The test had not proven anything yet. One night of mild weather did not mean the passage would hold when the real cold came. But it had proven something to Clara, proven that the air moved the way she had hoped, that the warmth pooled the way Niels had said it would, that the design was not just desperation given shape. She told Niels when he came back at dawn. "Good," he said. "Now we seal the leaks." They spent the next 3 days finishing what Clara had started. The tar paper needed lapping in places where she had rushed. The straw insulation had gaps that let drafts whistle through. The base of the passage, where it met the ground, was the worst. Clara had packed dirt against the frame, but dirt settled and shrank, and the wind found every crack. Niels showed her how to bank properly. He mixed mud with straw and manure, the same mixture her father had used to chink the Indiana farmhouse, and he packed it into the gaps with a wooden paddle, pressing until the mixture squeezed into every crevice. "Mud cracks when it dries," he said. "The straw holds it together. The manure." He smiled for the first time since Clara had met him. "The manure makes it stick." By the end of the 3rd day, the passage was sealed. It crouched between the cabin and the coop like a low brown tunnel, ugly as a root cellar and twice as crude. But when Clara crawled through it, she felt the difference, felt the way the air thickened as she moved from cabin to coop, the way the warmth gathered in the narrow space like water in a trough. The hens did not seem to mind the opening. They had grown used to Clara's comings and goings, and the new hole in their wall was just another gap to ignore. They roosted as they always roosted, packed tight on the wooden bars Jonah had built, their feathers fluffed against the cooling nights. 31 small furnaces, burning feed instead of wood. Clara counted them every morning now. 31, still 31. No losses yet. The weather held through the first week of October. The days grew shorter. The grass turned brown and brittle. The sky took on that hard blue quality that meant the air was drying out, losing the moisture that had made summer bearable. Clara split what wood she could, the green cottonwood that Abel had dismissed, the scraps of oak that Niels brought when he visited, and she stacked it against the cabin's south wall, where the passage would shield it from the worst of the wind. 3 cords. She had 3 cords now if she counted the green wood and the scraps. Still short. Still not enough. But more than she had started with. Abel Rusk came by on the 8th of October. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared at the edge of the property, the way he had appeared that first time, sitting on his gray horse and watching Clara work. She was on the roof of the passage, pressing fresh mud into a seam that had cracked overnight, when she saw him. "Mr. Rusk." "Mrs. Vale." He dismounted and walked to the passage. He did not touch it, but he looked at it the way a man looks at something he cannot quite believe. Head tilted, eyes narrow, mouth set in a line that was not quite frowning but was not smiling either. "You built it," he said. "I built it. Does it work?" Clara climbed down from the roof. "The water bucket has not frozen in 12 days. The cabin holds heat longer than it did before. The birds are still laying." "1 week of mild weather," Abel said. "That is not a test." "No. The test comes when the temperature drops, when the wind finds every crack you missed, When the snow piles against that thing and the moisture seeps in and the whole structure turns into an ice box instead of a heat box. He looked at her. I have seen men build clever things on this prairie, Mrs. Vale. Root cellars that collapsed, windbreaks that channeled the wind instead of blocking it, sod roofs that held for 3 winters and then caved in the 4th. He shook his head. Clever is not the same as sound. I know. Do you? Abel mounted his horse. I hope you do, because the weather is turning. I can smell it. 3 days, maybe 4, and we will have our first real blow. He gathered his reins. When that happens, I will come back, and we will see whether this thing you built is clever or sound. He rode away without saying goodbye. The smell came first. Clara woke on the morning of October 15th to a sky the color of old iron and a pressure in the air that made her ears ache. The wind had died overnight, completely, eerily, as if the prairie itself were holding its breath. The grass stood motionless. The chickens were silent in their coop. Even Eli, who usually woke chattering, lay still in his blankets and stared at the ceiling. "Mama," he said, "what is that smell?" Clara knew. She had smelled it once before, in Indiana, when a late spring blizzard had swept down from the north and buried the county in 2 feet of snow. It was the smell of cold coming, not cold that was already here, but cold that was on its way, rolling across the plains like a wave rolling toward shore. "Get dressed," she said. "Warm clothes, everything you have." She fed the stove until it roared. She checked the passage, running her hands along every seam, feeling for drafts. She checked the flap, testing the weight of the rod, making sure the leather moved freely. She checked the hens, counting them twice, 31, still 31, and scattering extra feed on the coop floor. By noon, the first clouds appeared on the northwest horizon. They were not normal clouds. They were low and thick and moving fast, a wall of gray that swallowed the sky as Clara watched. By 2 o'clock, the temperature had begun to drop. Clara had no thermometer. She measured cold the way her father had taught her, by the behavior of water, by the feel of metal, by the ache in her joints. At 2 o'clock, the water in the bucket was cold but liquid. By 3 o'clock, a skim of ice had formed around the edges. By 4 o'clock, the ice was a 1/4 inch thick and spreading toward the center. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees in 4 hours, and it was still falling. The wind arrived at sunset. It did not build gradually the way summer winds built. It arrived all at once, a solid wall of moving air that hit the cabin like a fist and did not stop. The tar paper on the passage roof began to flap. The hide flap on the cabin side began to shudder. The stove, which Clara had fed until it glowed, seemed suddenly small and inadequate, a candle in a cathedral of cold. Eli started to cough. The cough had been there for days, small, dry, nothing to worry about. But as the temperature dropped and the wind rose, the cough deepened. Eli's chest rattled when he breathed. His forehead, when Clara touched it, was hot. Fever. He had a fever. Clara felt panic rising in her throat like bile. A fever in summer was manageable. A fever in a blizzard was a death sentence. Eli needed warmth, real warmth, the kind of warmth that came from a roaring fire and a tight cabin and no gaps in the walls, the kind of warmth she did not have. She fed the stove again, using 4 sticks where she would normally use 2. The woodpile shrank visibly. At this rate, she would burn through her reserves in 3 days, maybe 4. And the storm showed no sign of stopping. The wind screamed outside. The cabin walls shuddered. The hide flap began to bang against its frame, once, twice, 3 times, and Clara realized with horror that one of the hinge pegs had slipped. If the flap blew open, the passage would become a wind tunnel. The warm air from the coop would be stripped away. The cold air from outside would pour through. Both spaces would freeze. Clara grabbed her coat and crawled into the passage. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The passage, which had been warm that morning, was now barely warmer than the cabin. The wind had found cracks she had missed, seams where the mud had not held. She could hear it whistling through the gaps, a high, thin sound like a tea kettle on the boil. She reached the flap and found the problem. The top hinge peg, a wooden dowel she had carved herself, had worked loose from its hole. The flap was hanging by 2 pegs instead of 3, swinging wildly with every gust, letting in jets of air that felt like knives. Clara braced herself against the frame and tried to push the peg back in. Her fingers were already numb. The wood was slick with frost. The peg slipped once, twice, and on the 3rd try she lost her grip entirely, and it fell into the darkness of the passage floor. She could not see it. She could not feel it. The passage was too dark, and her hands were too cold, and the wind was too loud. Behind her in the cabin, Eli coughed again. Clara did what she had to do. She tore a strip from her coat lining and wrapped it around the top hinge, tying the flap in place with cloth instead of wood. It was not a fix. It was a delay, but it held the flap closed, and that was enough for now. She crawled back into the cabin and found Eli sitting up in bed, his face flushed and his eyes too bright. "Mama," he said, "it is so cold." "I know, baby, I know." She wrapped him in every blanket they had. She boiled water on the stove and made him drink it, warming him from the inside out. She fed the stove again, 5 sticks this time, then 6, and watched the flames climb and knew that every stick she burned was a stick she would not have tomorrow. The storm raged through the night. Clara did not sleep. She could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the wind finding new gaps, new weaknesses, new ways to steal the heat she was fighting to keep. She heard the flap shuddering against its cloth binding. She heard Eli's breathing, thick and labored, and she counted the seconds between each cough. At midnight, someone knocked on the door. Clara grabbed the fire poker and pulled the door open an inch. The wind nearly tore it from her hand. Niels Torgen Moen stood on the step, covered in snow, his face raw from the cold. "The flap!" he shouted over the wind. "I saw it from the road. It is not holding." "I know, the peg slipped." "Let me in." She let him in. He did not waste time with greetings. He went straight to the passage, crawling through it the way Clara had crawled, and she heard him working in the darkness, hammering, adjusting, doing something she could not see. When he came back, his hands were bleeding. "I repegged it," he said. "Used a nail instead of a dowel. The nail will hold, but the passage is losing heat through the base. The ground has frozen, and the mud seal is cracking." He looked at the stove, at the shrinking woodpile, at Eli bundled in blankets with his fever-bright eyes. "You need more warmth. You need it now." "How?" Niels walked to the passage entrance and knelt beside the flap. He lifted it slightly, just an inch, and Clara felt the change immediately, a soft pulse of warm air, thick with the smell of feathers and straw. "The coop is holding," he said. "The birds are alive. They are packed tight on the roosts and throwing heat the way I knew they would." He adjusted the flap, widening the gap by another inch. "You have been keeping this too narrow. You were right to be careful, but careful is not working now. You need to open the throat." "The smell. The smell will not kill your boy. The cold will." Niels stood up. "Open it. Let the warm air in. Trust what you built." Clara looked at Eli, at the stove, at the flap, which now hung open wider than she had ever let it hang. The air that came through was not clean. It was thick with the smell of chickens, of manure, of 31 birds packed into a space too small for them. But it was warm. Warmer than the air near the stove. Warmer than anything Clara had felt since the storm began. She could feel the temperature in the cabin shift. Not dramatically, not like summer, but enough. Enough to make the difference between ice and water, between frozen and not. "There is one more thing," Niels said. "The coop is holding heat, but the air is getting foul. The birds are breathing all night, and the damp is building. If you do not vent it, they will sicken." He pointed toward the coop end of the passage. "I need to make a high vent, a small hole near the roof line, just big enough to let the bad air out without letting the cold air in. In this storm, it has to be now. If the birds suffocate or sicken, you lose your heat source. He pulled his coat tighter. I will be quick. He crawled back into the passage and disappeared toward the coop. Clara sat with Eli and listened to the storm rage and waited for Niels to come back. He was gone for half an hour. Clara counted the minutes by the rhythm of Eli's breathing. 3 breaths to a count, 60 counts to a minute, 1,800 counts to the half hour. She heard hammering from the coop end of the passage, muffled by the wind and the walls. She heard Niels cursing in Norwegian, words she did not understand but whose meaning was clear. When he came back, his hands were raw and his face was gray. Done, he said. A finger-width hole near the roofline, angled up so the snow cannot blow in. The foul air will rise and vent. The warm air will stay low. He sagged against the wall. The principle is the same as a chimney. You let the bad air out at the top, and the good air stays where you need it. Clara made him sit by the stove and drink hot water. His hands shook as he held the cup. You did not have to come, she said. I knew the flap would be the weak point. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something that might have been respect. You built well, Mrs. Vale. The passage is holding. The design is sound. But a design is only as good as its weakest part, and tonight the weakest part was a wooden peg in a leather loop. He smiled, a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. Next time, use a nail from the beginning. Outside, the storm continued to scream. The worst came at 3 a.m. Clara was dozing in the chair beside Eli's bed when she heard it, a sound like a cannon shot, deep and resonant, coming from somewhere outside. She jumped up and ran to the window, but there was nothing to see. The world beyond the oiled paper was pure white, a solid wall of snow driven horizontal by the wind. The sound came again, and again, and then a long grinding crash that seemed to shake the ground. She found out later what it was. Abel Rusk's lamb shed, the one he had built 3 years ago, the one he had been so proud of, had lost a wall. The wind had found a weakness in the frame, a joint that had loosened over time, and it had torn the boards away like paper. Half his winter feed was gone, buried under snow that would not melt until spring. 3 lambs were dead. 2 more would die by morning. Abel had built that shed the same way he had built everything else on his claim, solid, sensible, by the book. And the wind had taken it anyway. Clara's passage, ugly and crude and low to the ground, crouched between the cabin and the coop, and did not move. The wind could not find enough surface to grip. The snow could not pile high enough to crush it. The warmth inside, the warmth of 31 hens and 1 struggling stove, held steady through the night. Eli's fever did not break, but it did not climb either. He slept fitfully, coughing in his dreams, but his breathing stayed steady and his hands stayed warm. The kettle on the stove never skinned over, not once, all night. Clara watched the water shiver in the pot, liquid and unfrozen, and she understood what that meant. The temperature inside the cabin had not dropped below freezing. The passage was working. The birds were keeping them alive. Dawn came gray and slow. The storm did not stop, but it weakened. The wind dropped from a scream to a moan. The snow continued to fall, but now Clara could see shapes through it, the outline of the coop, the bulk of the woodpile, the low hump of the passage connecting them. She checked Eli first. His fever had broken sometime in the early hours. His forehead was damp but cool, and when he opened his eyes, they were clear. "Mama," he said, "I am hungry." Clara laughed. She could not help it. It was the most beautiful sentence she had ever heard. She fed him bread soaked in warm water. They had no milk, no butter, nothing but bread and the few eggs she had gathered the day before. He ate everything she gave him and asked for more. Then she crawled into the passage. The air was thick with the smell of chickens, worse than it had been the night before. The high vent Niels had cut was working. She could feel the faint pull of air near the roofline, but the smell would take days to clear. She did not care. The smell meant the birds were alive. She reached the coop and pushed through the flap on that end. 31 hens sat on their roosts, feathers fluffed, eyes bright. They clucked when they saw her, the same irritated greeting they always gave, as if the worst blizzard in a decade were merely an inconvenience. 31. Still 31. Clara counted them twice, then a third time, then sank down on the straw-covered floor and cried. The storm lasted 3 days. On the second day, the temperature dropped again, colder this time, cold enough that the air burned Clara's lungs when she went outside to check the woodpile. She learned later that it had fallen to 17 degrees below zero, a number that meant nothing to her except that the water in the outside bucket had frozen solid to the bottom. But inside the cabin, the temperature held. She burned less wood than she had expected. 4 cords worth of burning stretched to match what she had, because the passage was doing what she had designed it to do. The coop warmth crept through the hide flap, mixing with the stove heat, filling the dead spaces where cold air usually pooled. The cabin walls still leaked, but now there was warmth to spare. Warmth that came from 31 birds instead of split wood. On the third day, the sky cleared. Clara walked outside for the first time since the storm began. The prairie was transformed, every surface buried under snow, every landmark erased, every distance made strange by the blinding white. She could barely see Abel Rusk's place on the next rise, though she knew it was there. What she could see was the passage. It had drifted over on the north side, snow packed against the tar paper, until only the top was visible. But the structure had held. The frame had not buckled. The seams had not torn. It looked like something that had been there for years, something that belonged to the prairie instead of sitting on top of it. Niels came by at noon. He walked the property in silence, checking the passage, checking the coop, checking the cabin walls where the wind had driven snow through the gaps. The high vent held, he said finally. The birds are healthy. The flap is secure. He looked at Clara. You survived. We survived. Yes. He turned to leave, then stopped. There is a bachelor 3 miles south who nearly lost his toes last night. He smothered his stove in his sleep and woke to a frozen cabin. They found him this morning, alive but barely. That could have been me. Yes. Niels nodded. But it was not. Because you built something that worked, and he trusted what had always worked before. He shouldered his hatchet. Air is like money on the prairie, Mrs. Vale. Waste it wrong and you die poor. You did not waste it. He walked away across the snow, and Clara watched him go. Abel Rusk came that afternoon. He did not knock. He simply opened the cabin door and stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots, his face carved deeper than Clara had ever seen it. He looked at the passage entrance, at the hide flap, at Eli sitting up in bed eating bread. My lamb shed is gone, he said. I heard. 3 lambs dead. 2 more will not last the week. Half my winter feed is buried. He walked to the flap and lifted it, feeling the warm air that seeped through. This held. Yes. I said you would kill the boy by opening that wall. Abel let the flap fall. He turned to face Clara, and in his eyes she saw something she had not seen before. Not pity, not dismissal, something that looked almost like shame. I was wrong, he said. The words hung in the air like smoke. I have been on this prairie 9 winters, Abel continued. I have seen things that would break a strong man and things that would drive a wise man mad. I thought I knew what worked and what did not work. I thought I knew the rules. He shook his head. I did not know this. I did not know it either, Clara said. Not for certain. I only knew that the rules were going to kill us, and I had to try something else. Abel nodded. He walked to the door, then stopped with his hand on the latch. Mrs. Vale, he said, I told you that you would need 6 cords of wood to survive a hard winter. You have 3. Maybe less now. He looked at the passage, at the hide flap, at the warmth that came through it without burning a single stick. I think you may have found another way to count. He left without saying goodbye. But this time, Clara did not mind. The news traveled the way news always traveled on the prairie, slowly at first, then all at once. By the end of the week, people knew that Silas Pritchard's hired boy had nearly frozen on the road during the storm, caught 2 miles from town with a flour wagon that had lost a wheel. They knew that the bachelor to the south had lost 3 toes and would never walk right again. They knew that Abel Rusk's lamb shed was gone, and his winter feed with it. And they knew that the widow on the Vale claim, the one who had built a tunnel to her chicken coop, the one they had laughed at in the store, had survived with her son and her birds, and her woodpile barely touched. They did not call it a tunnel anymore. They called it the passage. Some of them, the ones who had seen it, called it the living hallway because the warmth that came through it was the warmth of living things, of 31 hens breathing and roosting and throwing heat into the dark. Martha Bell was the first to ask how it worked. She came by on the 5th day after the storm, when the roads were clear enough to travel. She brought bread and salt pork and a look on her face that Clara had never seen before, a look that was not judgment, not pity, but something like curiosity. "I want to see it," Martha said. Clara showed her. She showed her the frame, the tar paper, the straw insulation packed between the layers. She showed her the hide flap, the weighted rod, the way it settled closed but could be lifted with 2 fingers. She showed her the high vent Niels had cut, the angle of it, the way it let foul air out without letting cold air in. Martha listened. She asked questions. She wrote measurements in the dirt with a stick. "Could it work for a smaller flock?" she asked. "I have only 18 birds." 18 would be enough. The passage would be narrower, that is all. The principle is the same. Martha nodded. She looked at the passage, at the coop, at the cabin that had survived when larger structures had failed. "I told you this was fool's work," she said. "I remember. I was wrong." Martha picked up her breadbasket. "My husband is stubborn. He will not ask you for help, but if you were to come by and offer, if you were to show him what you showed me, I think he would listen." "I will come," Clara said. Martha left, and Clara understood for the first time that surviving the storm was only the beginning. The first visitor came 2 days after Martha left. His name was Peter Haugen, a Norwegian bachelor who worked a claim 4 miles northwest. He was 31 years old, thick through the shoulders, and he had lost a quarter of his flock in the storm, not to cold, but to damp. He had sealed his coop too tight, trying to keep the warmth in, and the moisture from the birds' breath had built up on the walls, dripped down onto their feathers, and frozen them where they roosted. He stood at the edge of Clara's property with his hat in his hands and asked if he could see the passage. Clara showed him. She walked him through every detail the way she had walked Martha, the frame, the tar paper, the straw insulation, the hide flap, the high vent. She explained why the opening sat low on the cabin side and high on the coop side. She explained why the flap needed weight at the bottom, but not too much. She explained why the vent mattered, why you could not seal a coop full of breathing birds and expect them to survive. Peter listened. He asked questions. He measured the passage with his eyes the way Abel Rusk had measured it, but where Abel had been looking for flaws, Peter was looking for understanding. "I sealed mine too tight," he said when she finished. "I thought tight was safe. I did not know about the damp." "My father taught me," Clara said. "He lost half a flock the same way when I was a girl. Wet chickens die. Everyone knows that, but not everyone knows that the wet comes from the birds themselves, not just from outside." Peter nodded. He looked at the passage one more time, memorizing it, and then he put his hat back on and thanked her. "I will build one," he said. "Before the next storm. I will build one, or I will lose the rest." He walked away across the snow, and Clara watched him go. The second visitor came the next day, and the third the day after that. Word spread the way it always spread on the prairie, through women at the store, through men at the livery, through children who overheard their parents talking and repeated what they heard without understanding it. The widow on the Vale claim had survived the storm. The widow on the Vale claim had built something strange. The widow on the Vale claim was showing people how to do it. They came from 5 miles away, then 10. They came on foot and on horseback and in wagons that struggled through the snow-packed roads. Some of them had lost birds. Some of them had lost livestock. One man had lost a barn wall, just like Abel, and he wanted to know if the passage principle could work for a larger structure. Clara showed them all. She did not charge. She did not barter. She showed them the way her father had shown her, through demonstration, through explanation, through the patient repetition of details that mattered. She let them touch the hide flap and feel the weight of the rod. She let them crawl through the passage and smell the warm air that came from the coop. She let them count her birds, 31, still 31, and see for themselves that the method worked. Not everyone believed. Some of them came skeptical and left skeptical, convinced that Clara had gotten lucky with wind direction or building placement or some other factor she could not explain. But most of them believed. Most of them saw what Abel had seen, what Martha had seen, what Peter had seen, that the passage was not luck. It was design. By the end of the second week after the storm, 4 families had started building their own versions. Silas Pritchard heard the news the way he heard all news, through the flow of customers at his store, through the gossip that gathered around his counter like flies around spilled sugar. He did not like what he heard. The widow who should have failed was succeeding. The widow who should have crawled back for flour on credit was teaching other people how to survive. The widow whose claim he had hoped to buy for pennies was becoming someone people respected instead of pitied. Silas could not attack her directly. The storm had proven her right in ways that everyone could see. But he could attack sideways. He could plant doubts. He could spread the kind of quiet poison that did not kill immediately but weakened over time. He started with the smell. "Chicken air," he said to anyone who would listen. "She's filling her cabin with chicken air, damp and dust and the smell of manure. That boy of hers will be sick by spring, mark my words, lung fever, consumption, something that gets into the chest and does not leave." The words traveled. They reached Clara through Martha Bell, who came by one afternoon with a look on her face that was equal parts warning and disgust. "Silas is talking," Martha said. "He says your method brings sickness. He says the coop air will make children sick." Clara felt the old familiar anger rising in her chest, the anger she had felt in the store when Silas had mocked her in front of everyone. But she pushed it down. Anger would not help her now. "Has any child gotten sick from my passage?" she asked. "Eli had a fever during the storm." "Eli had a fever before the storm. The passage kept him warm enough to break it." Clara gestured at the cabin, at the coop, at the space between them. "My birds are alive. My boy is healthy. My woodpile is fuller than anyone expected it to be. What proof does Silas have that his words are true?" Martha had no answer. "He has no proof," Clara said. "He has fear. He has the hope that I will fail so he can profit from my failure. But hope is not proof, and fear is not fact." Martha nodded slowly. "What do you want me to do?" "Tell people what you have seen. Tell them Eli is healthy. Tell them the birds are laying. Tell them the cabin is warm." Clara looked at her. "The truth is better than any argument I could make. Let Silas argue with the truth." Niels came by less often as the winter deepened. The first few weeks after the storm, he had visited every other day, checking seams, adjusting the flap tension, helping Clara rebuild the sections that had weakened under the wind's assault. But as December arrived and the days grew short, his visits stretched to once a week, then less. Clara noticed the change in him before she understood it. He moved more slowly than he had before. His breathing, which had always been steady, now came in shallow pulls that rattled in his chest. When he lifted his hatchet, his hands trembled in ways they had not trembled during the storm. "You are sick," Clara said one afternoon, when they were working on a second flap, a backup, in case the first one failed. Niels did not deny it. "A chest cold. It will pass. You should rest." "I have rested enough in my life." He drove a nail with more force than necessary. "I did not come to this country to sit by a fire and wait for death. I came to build things." Clara let it go. She had learned in the months since Jonah's death that some arguments were not worth having. Men like Niels did not stop working because they were sick. They stopped working when they could not lift the hammer anymore. They finished the second flap in silence. When Niels left, Clara watched him walk across the snow toward his wagon, and she saw the way his shoulders hunched against the cold, the way his steps had shortened, the way his breath came out in clouds that were too thick and too fast. She did not know it then, but she was watching him leave for one of the last times. The collaborative work continued despite Niels's declining health. He came when he could, sometimes twice in a week, sometimes not for 10 days, and when he came, they built. They did not build passages. They built improvements. A stiffer flap rod that would not warp in wet weather, a double banking system for longer passages where the insulation was layered in 2 sections with an air gap between, a removable inner slat that could be pulled out and cleaned when the litter from the coop contaminated the airflow. Each improvement came from a problem. The stiff rod came from a neighbor whose flap had warped and jammed open during a mild spell. The double banking came from a family 6 miles south, whose passage had frozen through because the insulation was too thin. The removable slat came from Clara's own observation that the passage smelled worse after a month of use and needed a way to be cleaned without tearing it apart. Niels taught her through building. He showed her how to cut joints that would not pull apart under stress. He showed her how to lap tar paper so the seams faced away from the prevailing wind. He showed her how to test a structure's soundness by pressing hard in the places where failure was most likely. "Every building wants to fall down," he said once, while they were reinforcing a neighbor's frame. "Gravity and wind and water are always working against you. Your job is not to fight them. Your job is to redirect them." Clara remembered. She wrote his words down in the margin of Jonah's old ledger, next to the measurements and calculations she had started keeping. One afternoon, when the light was gray and the wind was quiet, Niels told her about his life before Dakota. He had been a carpenter in Norway, he said, a builder of fishing sheds and smokehouses, and the tight winter passages that connected barn to farmhouse in the mountain villages where snow fell for 6 months at a time. He had come to America in 1853, landed in Wisconsin, and spent 20 years building in places so cold that the nails froze to his fingers. "I thought I knew cold," he said. "Then I came to Dakota." "Why did you come?" "My wife died." He said it flat, the way people said things they had said too many times to feel anymore. "Cancer of the stomach. She was gone in 3 months. After that, there was nothing to keep me in Wisconsin." Clara did not know what to say. She had lost Jonah, but Jonah's death had been sudden, a wagon axle, a great outside Huron, a letter that arrived instead of a man. Niels had watched his wife disappear slowly, piece by piece, over 3 months of pain. "I am sorry," she said. "So am I." Niels picked up his hatchet. "But sorry does not build anything. Grief does not stack wood. The only thing that matters is what you do with your hands while your heart is breaking." They worked in silence for the rest of the afternoon. The disagreement came in late January. A family named Strand had built a passage based on Clara's design, but they had made it longer than she recommended, 18 feet instead of 12, and they had used thinner insulation to save money. The passage worked in mild weather, but when the temperature dropped below 0, the warmth dissipated before it could reach the cabin. Niels wanted to tear it down and rebuild it properly. Clara wanted to modify it, add more insulation, shorten the effective length with an interior baffle, make it work without forcing the strands to start over. "You cannot fix a bad foundation," Niels said. "The frame is wrong. The proportions are wrong. If you patch it, you are teaching them that patching is acceptable. Next time, they will build something even worse and expect you to fix that too." "They cannot afford to rebuild," Clara said. "They spent everything they had on materials. If we tear it down, they lose the wood and the labor and the hope." "Hope does not keep people warm. Neither does a passage they do not have because we destroyed the one they built." They stood in the Strand's yard, arguing while the family watched from the cabin doorway. Clara could see the fear in their eyes, the fear of people who had gambled on something new and were now watching 2 builders disagree about whether it would work. "I will modify it," Clara said finally. "If it fails, I will help them rebuild. But I will not tear down something that might work just because it is not built the way you would build it." Niels looked at her for a long moment. His face was hard to read. Anger, maybe, or frustration, or something else entirely. "You are stubborn," he said. "I learned from you." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but something close to it. "Fine," he said. "We modify, but you do the work. I want to see if you can fix someone else's mistake the way I taught you to fix your own." Clara fixed it. She added insulation, built a baffle at the halfway point, created a two-stage system where the first half of the passage warmed the air before it reached the second half. It was not elegant. It was not what Niels would have built, but it worked. The Strands' cabin stayed warm through the next cold snap. And Clara learned something she had not expected. The teaching was not just about showing people the right way. It was about meeting them where they were and helping them make the wrong way work. Niels died on the 4th of March. Clara did not know it at first. She had not seen him in 2 weeks, the longest gap since they had met, and she had assumed he was resting, recovering from the chest cold that had plagued him all winter. She had been busy with visitors, with teaching, with the endless small repairs that a winter cabin demanded. Then Peter Haugen came to her door with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she recognized immediately. "Mr. Moen passed this morning," Peter said. "In his sleep. They found him in his chair with his hatchet in his lap." Clara did not cry. She did not speak. She stood in the doorway and felt the cold wind on her face and understood that something had ended that would never come back. Peter held out a bundle wrapped in canvas. "He left this for you. Told me 3 weeks ago, when he knew he was not getting better. Said you would know what to do with it." Clara took the bundle. She unwrapped it slowly, already knowing what she would find. The auger. Niels's auger. The one he had carried on his shoulder the first day he came to her claim. The one he had used to bore holes in oak and pine and cottonwood from Wisconsin to Dakota. The handle was worn smooth from 40 years of use. The blade was still sharp. There was a note tucked into the canvas. Clara unfolded it with hands that shook. "Mrs. Vale," the note read, "air is like money on the prairie. Waste it wrong and you die poor. You did not waste it. Build well. NTM." Clara read the note twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket, next to the measurements she had written in Jonah's ledger, next to the words she had saved because they mattered. She did not go to the funeral. She could not bear to see him in a box, still and cold, when she remembered him moving and working and teaching with every breath. Instead, she took the auger to the passage and bored a new hole in the frame, a small hole, unnecessary, pointless, except as a way to use his tool and feel his hands guiding hers one more time. The sawdust fell like snow. Clara watched it drift to the ground and understood that grief did not build anything, but building was how you carried grief forward without letting it crush you. He had come to her claim because he saw something in her measurements. He had stayed because she learned. He had left her the only thing he owned that mattered, a tool and a lesson wrapped together in 7 words. Air is like money on the prairie. Clara would never forget. The secondary crisis came 3 weeks later. Martha Bell's youngest child, a girl named Sarah, 4 years old, developed a cough in early March. At first it seemed like the ordinary coughs that children got every winter, the kind that came and went with the weather. But this cough did not go. It deepened. It rattled. It woke the child at night and left her gasping for breath. Croup, Martha thought, or something like it, something that settled in the chest and did not leave. Thomas Bell was away, hauling lumber from Brookings, a trip that would take him a week in good weather and longer if the roads turned muddy. Martha was alone with 4 children and a sick girl, and a passage that she had built based on Clara's design but had not tested through a serious cold snap. The cold snap came on the 3rd night of Thomas's absence. The temperature dropped 30 degrees between sunset and midnight. The wind came up from the northwest, the killing wind, the one that found every crack and turned every gap into a knife. Martha fed the stove until it roared and checked the passage, and realized with horror that she had made a mistake. The flap was too light. She had weighted it with a wooden rod instead of a heavier iron bar, and the wind was catching it, lifting it, letting in jets of cold air that stripped the warmth from the cabin as fast as the stove could produce it. Sarah's breathing grew worse. Her lips turned blue in the lamplight. Martha did what she had to do. She bundled Sarah in every blanket she had, left the older children with instructions to feed the stove and not open the door, and she ran through the storm to Clara's claim. Clara was asleep when the pounding came. She woke to the sound of fists on wood, urgent and desperate, and she knew before she opened the door that something was wrong. No one knocked like that in the middle of the night unless someone was dying. Martha stood on the step, coated in snow, her face wild with fear. "Sarah," she gasped. "She cannot breathe. The passage is not working. The flap, I built it wrong. The cold is getting through." Clara did not hesitate. She grabbed her coat, her gloves, the auger that Niels had left her. She woke Eli and told him to stay in bed, to feed the stove if it got low, to not open the door for anyone. Then she followed Martha into the storm. The walk to the Bell claim should have taken 20 minutes. In the storm, it took almost an hour. The wind cut through Clara's coat like it was not there. The snow drove into her face, blinding her, forcing her to walk with her head down and her hand on Martha's shoulder. She could not see more than 5 feet in any direction. She navigated by feel, by the slope of the ground, by the knowledge she had built over months of walking this prairie in every kind of weather. When they reached the cabin, Clara could hear Sarah coughing from outside. She went straight to the passage. Martha had built it well. The frame was sound. The seams were tight. The insulation was adequate. But the flap was wrong. Clara could see it immediately. The wooden rod at the bottom was too light, and worse, it was set at the wrong angle. Instead of hanging straight down, it tilted forward, creating a gap at the bottom that let the wind whistle through. "Hold the lamp," Clara said. She pulled out the auger and went to work. She could not fix the rod, not in the dark, not in the storm, not with the child dying inside the cabin. But she could change the angle. She bored 2 new holes in the frame, 6 inches lower than the original ones, and she rehung the flap so it sat against the frame instead of away from it. The gap closed. The whistling stopped. But that was not enough. The passage had lost too much heat already. The coop air, which should have been warm and thick with bird breath, was cold. The birds had huddled away from the draft, and their warmth was not reaching the passage. Clara crawled through to the coop. She found Martha's hens pressed into one corner, feathers fluffed, silent with fear. She spread fresh straw around them, blocking the draft from the passage entrance, creating a pocket of still air where their body heat could build. Then she remembered Niels's lesson, the high vent. Martha had not cut one. She had sealed the coop completely, thinking that tight was safe, the same mistake that Pater Haugen had made. The air inside was thick and damp, heavy with the moisture of 20 birds breathing all night. Clara took the auger and bored a hole in the coop roof. A small hole, finger width, angled up so the snow could not blow in. The high vent Niels had taught her to make. The effect was immediate. She felt the air shift, the pressure change, the foul dampness begin to rise and escape. The warmth at ground level stabilized. The birds shifted on their roosts, settling, calming. Clara crawled back through the passage. The air that came with her was warmer now, not warm, but warmer, warm enough to make a difference. Inside the cabin, Sarah was still coughing, but her lips were pink again. Her breathing, while labored, was no longer the desperate gasping it had been when Clara arrived. Martha sat beside her daughter's bed and wept. "She is better," Martha said. "Already better. I can hear it." Clara sat down on the floor, exhausted, her hands raw from the auger, her face burned by the wind. She thought about Niels, about the lesson he had taught her in the middle of a blizzard, about the high vent that had saved her birds and was now saving Martha's child. "You cannot seal a space full of breathing things," he had said. "You let the bad air out at the top, and the good air stays where you need it." She had not forgotten. She had applied the lesson when it mattered, without him there to guide her. That was what teaching meant. That was what legacy meant. Not the person, but the knowledge they left behind. The storm broke the next morning. Clara stayed until Thomas Bell returned 2 days later. She helped Martha adjust the passage, showing her how to test the flap tension, how to check for drafts, how to recognize the signs of foul air building in a sealed space. She showed the older children, too, so they would know what to do if their mother was ever alone again. Sarah recovered. The cough lingered for another week, then faded. By the end of March, she was running through the thawing mud like every other 4-year-old on the prairie, oblivious to how close she had come to something worse. Word spread, the way word always spread. The widow on the Vale claim had saved Martha Bell's daughter. The widow on the Vale claim had walked through a blizzard to fix a passage that was killing a child. The widow on the Vale claim knew things about air and warmth and survival that other people did not know. People came to Clara now, not to see the passage. They had seen it, or heard about it, or built their own versions. They came to ask questions, to learn, to understand not just what to build, but why it worked and how to fix it when it failed. Clara taught them all. She taught them about flap tension and high vents, and the danger of sealing a space too tight. She taught them about moisture and damp, and the way wet cold killed faster than dry cold. She taught them about airflow and pressure, and the principle that Niels had taught her, that air was like money, and you died poor if you wasted it wrong. She did not charge. She did not ask for anything in return. She taught because teaching was how you kept knowledge alive, and keeping knowledge alive was how you honored the people who had given it to you. Silas Pritchard heard about Sarah Bell. He heard that the widow had saved the child. He heard that the widow had walked through a blizzard to do it. He heard that the widow was now being called a healer by some of the more superstitious families, a woman who understood winter the way a doctor understood disease. He did not like what he heard. Silas had built his life on a simple principle. Other people's failures were his opportunities. When homesteaders failed, he bought their claims. When farmers went into debt, he extended credit at rates that guaranteed they would owe him forever. When widows and orphans lost their providers, he was there to pick up the pieces, always fairly, always legally, always with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Clara Vale was not failing. Clara Vale was succeeding in ways that made other people succeed too. Every family that built a passage was a family that did not need his credit to survive the winter. Every neighbor that learned from Clara was a neighbor that would not sell their claim to him in desperation. She was costing him money. Worse, she was costing him power. Silas tried one more attack. He spread a new story, that Clara's method only worked because she had help from Niels Torgen Mohn, and now that Niels was dead, the knowledge would die with him. He implied that Clara was a fraud, a woman who had gotten lucky and was now pretending to understand things she did not understand. The story did not stick. Too many people had seen Clara work. Too many people had watched her teach, had learned from her hands, had built passages under her supervision that worked exactly as she said they would. Too many people knew that Clara was not pretending, that she understood the principles, the physics, the why behind the how. One by one, the doubters fell away. One by one, the skeptics converted or went silent. One by one, the people who had laughed at the widow with her chicken tunnel became the people who asked her advice before they built anything for winter. Silas Pritchard watched it happen and said nothing. But Clara knew he was not finished. Men like Silas never admitted defeat. They waited. They watched. They looked for the moment when success turned to failure and opportunity opened again. She would have to be ready when that moment came. Spring arrived slowly, the way spring always arrived on the Dakota prairie, in fits and starts, in thaws that turned to freezes, in mud that hardened to ice and then softened to mud again. The passage held through all of it. Clara took it apart in April, when the nights grew warm enough that the birds no longer needed supplemental heat. She saved the hide flap, the weighted rod, the tar paper that was still sound. She burned the straw insulation and spread the ash on her garden plot. She stacked the frame pieces in the lean-to, ready for next winter. She stood in the space where the passage had been, 12 feet of bare ground between the cabin and the coop, and she thought about everything that had happened since she built it. The storm, the visitors, the teaching, Niels, Martha's daughter. The slow, steady transformation of a desperate gamble into something that other people trusted and used. She had come to this claim with nothing but chickens and debt and a dead man's half-finished dream. She had survived the winter with something more. But surviving was not enough. Surviving was just the beginning. The question now was what she would become, not just a widow who had lived through one hard season, but a woman who had changed the way people thought about winter. The question was whether she could keep changing it. The question was what she would build next. The second winter was easier than the first. Not easy. Nothing on the Dakota prairie was ever easy, but easier. Clara had time now. She had knowledge. She had a woodpile that stood at 5 cords by the first frost, stacked against the south wall where the passage would shield it from the worst of the weather. She had a cabin that was properly chinked, every gap sealed with the mud and straw mixture that Niles had taught her. She had a coop that was larger than before, 12 birds richer after a summer of successful hatching, and a passage that she had rebuilt in boarded form instead of canvas and tar paper. The new passage was not pretty. It was low and squat and dark, planks nailed tight over a frame of oak and pine, insulated with straw and banked with earth until it looked more like a burial mound than a building. But it was solid. It was sound. It was built to last. Clara tested it in October when the first hard frost came. She lit a tallow stub and held it at the base of the flap, watching the flame bend toward the warmth that seeped through from the coop. The air that came through was thick and heavy, the smell of 43 birds packed close together on their roosts, breathing and warming and throwing heat into the dark. 43? She had started with 31. Eli stood beside her, watching. He was 7 now, tall for his age, with his father's dark hair and his mother's steady eyes. He had spent the summer helping Clara rebuild the passage, carrying boards, holding nails, learning to measure the way Niels had taught Clara to measure. "Is it working?" he asked. "It is working." "How can you tell?" Clara pointed at the flame. "The air moves. It moves from the coop to the cabin because the coop is warmer and the cabin is cooler. Warm air always wants to move toward cold air. Our job is to let it move when we want it to and stop it when we do not." Eli nodded. He did not fully understand. He was 7, but he understood enough. He understood that his mother had built something that mattered, and that understanding how it worked was part of his inheritance. Clara let the flap fall and turned toward the cabin. The stove was already lit. The woodpile was full. The supplies were stacked in the corner where they would stay dry through the winter. Everything was ready. Everything except the question of what would happen next. The visitors still came, but they came differently now. In the first winter, they had come to see the passage, to marvel at it, to doubt it, to ask whether it could possibly work. In the second winter, they came to learn. They came with measurements and questions and problems they had encountered while building their own versions. They came to ask Clara things that only she could answer. How wide should the opening be for a flock of 20 birds? How heavy should the flap rod be for a cabin that faced the northwest wind? How could you tell when the air in a coop was turning foul before it was too late? Clara answered them all. She answered them the way Niels had answered her, through demonstration, through explanation, through the patient repetition of principles that mattered. She showed them how to test airflow with a candle flame. She showed them how to feel for drafts with wet fingers. She showed them how to read the frost patterns on a wall and understand what they meant about where heat was escaping. By the middle of November, 7 families within hauling distance of De Smet had some version of Clara's passage. Some linked coop to cabin, the way Clara's did. Some linked shed to kitchen lean-to. One family, the Strands, whose passage Clara had modified against Niels's advice, had built a double passage connecting their cabin to both the coop and the woodshed, creating a protected path that let them reach their fuel without going outside in a blizzard. The method was spreading, the knowledge was multiplying, and Clara was no longer just a widow who had survived one hard winter. She was the woman people came to when they wanted to understand how not to waste heat. Silas Pritchard's reckoning came in December. He had watched Clara's success through 2 seasons now, watched her teach, watched her build, watched her transform from a woman he had mocked into a woman people respected. He had tried to undermine her with gossip and failed. He He had tried to outlast her reputation and failed. He had run out of ways to attack, and the winter was coming whether he liked it or not. Silas had made a decision in the fall. If Clara's method worked for chickens, maybe it would work for something larger. He had acquired a small flock of his own, 15 birds, bought cheap from a family heading back east, and he had built a coop behind his store to winter them. The eggs would be worth good money in February, when every other flock in the county had stopped laying. The profit would prove that he did not need Clara's help, that he understood the principle as well as she did. He built the coop himself. He sealed it tight, the way he sealed everything. No gaps, no drafts, no weaknesses that the cold could exploit. He banked it with earth and covered it with tar paper and told himself that it was better than anything Clara had ever built. He did not cut a high vent. The first hard freeze came on the 12th of December. The temperature dropped to 23 below zero. The wind blew all night, driving snow against the walls of every building in town. In the morning, 6 of Silas's birds were dead. They had not frozen, they had suffocated. The coop was so tight that the moisture from their breath had built up overnight, condensing on the walls, dripping onto their feathers, creating a damp that killed as surely as cold. The survivors were huddled in one corner, feathers soaked, eyes dull with shock. Silas did not understand what had happened. He had sealed the coop perfectly. He had done everything right. But 6 birds were dead, and more would follow if he did not figure out what he had done wrong. He swallowed his pride and walked to Clara's claim. Clara was in the passage when she heard the knock. She had been checking the seams, looking for any gaps that might have opened overnight, when the sound came from the cabin door. She crawled back through and opened it to find Silas Pritchard standing on her step, his hat in his hands, his face the color of old ash. "Mrs. Vale," he said. "Mr. Pritchard." They stood there for a moment, 2 people who had been enemies for 18 months, looking at each other across a threshold that neither of them wanted to cross. "I lost 6 birds last night," Silas said finally. "I do not know why." Clara did not gloat. She did not remind him of the things he had said in the store, the gossip he had spread, the way he had tried to profit from her failure. She simply asked the question that mattered. "How did you build your coop?" Silas described it. He described the tight walls, the banked earth, the tar paper roof. He described the way he had sealed every gap, every crack, every possible place where cold air could enter. "Did you cut a high vent?" Clara asked. Silas frowned. "A what?" "A vent. Near the roof line. A small hole angled up to let the bad air out." "Why would I cut a hole in a roof I am trying to keep warm?" Clara understood then. Silas had made the same mistake that Pater Haugen had made, that Martha Bell had nearly made, that dozens of others had made before they learned better. He had thought that tight was safe. He had not understood that a coop full of breathing birds was not a box. It was a living system, and living systems needed to breathe. "Come with me," she said. She took him to her coop. She showed him the high vent that Niels had taught her to cut, a finger-width hole near the roof line, angled up so the snow could not blow in, positioned so the foul air could rise and escape. She showed him how to feel for the draft with wet fingers, how to tell whether the vent was working by the way the air moved near the roosts. "The birds breathe all night," she said. "Their breath is wet. If the wet has nowhere to go, it builds up on the walls, drips down, soaks their feathers. Wet chickens die. You cannot seal a space full of breathing things and expect them to live." Silas listened. He did not argue. He did not defend himself or explain why he had built the way he had built. He simply listened, the way Clara's students listened, the way people listened when they finally understood that they had something to learn. "Where should I cut the vent?" he asked. "On the north side, near the peak. Angle it up at 45 degrees. Make it no wider than your finger. Too wide, and you lose too much heat. Too narrow, and it does not clear the air." Silas nodded. He put his hat back on and turned to leave. "Mr. Pritchard," Clara said. He stopped. "Cut the vent today. Before tonight. If you wait, you will lose more birds." Silas looked at her. In his eyes, Clara saw something she had never expected to see. Not gratitude, exactly, but something close to it. Something that acknowledged what she had done without apologizing for what he had done. "Thank you, Mrs. Vale," he said. He walked away across the snow. Clara watched him go and felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not friendship, but something like balance. Silas Pritchard had come to her for help, and she had given it. That was enough. That was more than enough. She went back to checking the seams. The man who arrived in late March was not what Clara expected. His name was Ezra Bell, Thomas Bell's widowed cousin, a teamster who hauled lumber from Brookings to the settlements scattered across the eastern Dakota prairie. He was 34 years old, quiet in the way of men who spent most of their time with horses instead of people, and he had come to Clara's claim not to learn about passages, but to deliver a load of oak that Thomas had ordered on her behalf. "From Thomas and Martha," Ezra said, climbing down from the wagon. "Payment for what you did for Sarah." Clara looked at the oak. It was good wood, straight-grained, well-seasoned, the kind of wood that cost more than she could afford. There was enough there to rebuild the passage twice over, enough to frame a new addition to the cabin, enough to last for years if she used it carefully. "This is too much," she said. "Martha does not think so." Ezra began unloading the boards, stacking them neatly beside the lean-to. "She says Sarah would have died that night. She says you walked through a blizzard to save her daughter." He glanced at Clara. "Is that true?" "I walked through a blizzard to fix a flap that was hanging wrong. Sarah saved herself by being strong enough to hold on until the warmth came back." Ezra nodded. He did not argue or contradict or tell her she was being modest. He simply continued unloading the wood, working steadily, efficiently, the way a man worked when he knew how to work and did not need to prove it. Clara found herself watching him. He moved the boards without strain, lifting weights that would have staggered most men, placing them precisely where they needed to go. His hands were calloused in the way of men who handled reins and ropes and rough lumber all day. His face was weathered, but not hard. There was something in his eyes that suggested he had seen difficulty and come through it without becoming bitter. "You are Thomas's cousin?" she asked. "His father's sister's son. I grew up in Wisconsin, same as Thomas. Came out here 3 years ago after my wife passed." "I'm sorry." "So am I." He set down the last board and turned to face her. "But sorry does not haul lumber. Sorry does not build barns. I figure the best thing a person can do after losing someone is keep working until the work fills up the space they left." Clara thought of Niels. She thought of the auger hanging in her lean-to, the note she kept folded in her pocket, the words she had repeated to herself so many times they had become a kind of prayer. Grief does not stack wood. The only thing that matters is what you do with your hands while your heart is breaking. "I think that is right," she said. Ezra looked at her, really looked at her, the way few men had looked at her since Jonah died. Not with pity, not with dismissal, not with the calculation of someone trying to figure out what she was worth. He looked at her the way one worker looked at another, recognizing something familiar. "Thomas says you built something," he said. "A passage between your cabin and your coop. He says you taught half the county how to do it." "I taught anyone who asked." "Would you show me?" Clara showed him. She walked him through the way she had walked Martha and Pater and all the others, the frame, the insulation, the flap, the vents. She explained the principles the way Niels had explained them to her, through demonstration and measurement and the patient repetition of details that mattered. She let him crawl through the passage and feel the warmth that came from the coop, let him touch the hide flap and test the weight of the rod. When they emerged on the cabin side, Ezra stood for a long moment, looking at the structure with an expression Clara could not read. "You built this alone?" he asked. "I had help, a man named Niels Torgen Mohn. He taught me most of what I know about framing and sealing. He died in March." "I am sorry." "So am I." Clara touched the frame, feeling the rough grain of the wood under her fingers. "But he left me enough to keep building. I think that is what he would have wanted." Ezra nodded. He walked back to his wagon and climbed up onto the seat, gathering the reins. But before he drove away, he turned back to her. Mrs. Vale, he said, I haul lumber through here every 6 weeks or so. If you ever need anything brought from Brookings, boards, nails, tar paper, anything, I could add it to my load. No extra charge. Just tell Thomas what you need and I will bring it. Why would you do that? Ezra smiled a small smile, barely visible under the brim of his hat. Because I have hauled lumber to 100 claims on this prairie, and I have never seen anyone build something that looked like it belonged. This does. He nodded at the passage. This looks like it was always supposed to be here. He drove away. Clara watched until the wagon disappeared over the rise, then turned back to the oak boards he had left behind. She had work to do. The courtship unfolded the way prairie courtships unfolded, slowly, practically, through the accumulation of small moments rather than grand gestures. Ezra came back 6 weeks later with a load of pine for a family 20 miles south. He stopped at Clara's claim on the way, helped her repair a section of roof that had sagged under the winter snow, and stayed for dinner. They talked about lumber and weather and the price of nails in Brookings. They did not talk about feelings. He came back again in June with a delivery for Thomas Bell. He helped Clara extend the coop, adding a new section that would house the growing flock through the coming winter. They worked side by side for 2 days, measuring and cutting and nailing, and Clara discovered that Ezra worked the way Niels had worked, steadily, efficiently, without wasted motion or unnecessary words. He came back in August with no delivery at all. He said he had been passing through. He said he thought she might need help with the hay. She did need help with the hay. They worked for a week cutting and stacking, and at the end of the week, Ezra asked if he could come back again. Clara said yes. By the end of the second year, they were married. It was not a grand wedding. It was not a romantic story. It was two people who had lost spouses and found in each other not passion but partnership, the kind of partnership that came from working together, from respecting each other's competence, from understanding that building a life required the same patience and precision as building a passage. Ezra moved on to the claim. He brought his horses and his wagon and his skills, and together they expanded what Clara had started. They built a proper barn. They built a larger cabin with 2 rooms instead of 1. They built a passage that was 3 feet wide and 14 feet long, with a double flap system that Ezra designed and Clara refined, warm enough to walk through in shirt sleeves even when the temperature outside was 30 below. Eli called him father by the end of the first year. Clara called him partner, because that was what he was, not a savior, not a provider, not a man who had rescued a helpless widow. A partner, someone who had recognized what she had built and wanted to build alongside her. The years compressed the way years always compressed, slowly at first, then all at once. Clara had 2 more children with Ezra, a daughter in 1883 and a son in 1885. The daughter she named Sigrid, after a great aunt she barely remembered. The son she named Niels, after the man who had taught her how to think in channels. The claim grew. The flock expanded to 60 birds, then 80, more than any reasonable family needed, but Clara kept them because they were proof of something. Proof that the method worked. Proof that the first desperate gamble had been right. She continued to teach. People came from further away now, not just from De Smet and the surrounding claims, but from towns she had never visited, from counties she had only seen on maps. They came to see the woman who had built the living hallway, the woman who had survived the long winter with nothing but chickens and knowledge and the stubbornness to try something no one had tried before. Clara showed them all. She showed them the way Niels had shown her, the way her father had shown her, the way generations of people had always shown each other the things that mattered. She laid her hands on the wood and let them feel what she felt. She spoke the measurements aloud and let them write them down. She answered every question, no matter how simple, because simple questions were the ones that mattered most. By the end of the decade, more than 30 families within traveling distance had some version of Clara's design. Some were simple, a 12-foot passage with a single flap. Some were complex, multi-stage systems with baffles and vents and double insulation. Some were elegant and some were ugly, and all of them worked, because Clara had taught the principles and let people adapt them to their own needs. The method spread because it saved what frontier households could least afford to lose: fuel, birds, and sleep. It spread because it worked. It spread because Clara had never charged for the knowledge, had never hoarded it, had never treated it as something that belonged to her instead of something that belonged to everyone who needed it. Abel Rusk died in 1889, 9 years after he had told Clara that she would kill her boy by opening that wall. He died in his sleep, in a cabin that had a passage of its own, a passage he had built 3 winters after the storm, following measurements that Clara had given him when he finally asked. Clara went to his funeral. She stood at the back of the small gathering and listened to people talk about the man he had been, harsh but honest, doubtful but fair, someone who had seen too much death to believe easily in hope. She did not speak. She did not need to. Abel had said what needed to be said years ago, standing in her doorway with his iron eyes and his 9 winters of certainty. I was wrong. That was enough. That was more than enough. Silas Pritchard sold his store in 1892 and moved back east. He told people he was tired of the winters, tired of the isolation, tired of the endless struggle to make a living on the edge of nowhere. But Clara knew the real reason. The prairie had changed. The desperate, failing homesteaders he had preyed on were fewer now, replaced by people who knew how to survive, who helped each other instead of competing, who had learned that cooperation was more profitable than exploitation. There was no place for Silas Pritchard in that world. Clara did not gloat when she heard he had gone. She did not celebrate or tell people what he had done to her. She simply noted his absence the way she noted the absence of any predator, with relief and a quiet resolve to remember what he had taught her about the kind of person she did not want to become. Eli grew tall. He grew into a young man with his father's quiet strength and his mother's steady eyes, and when he was old enough, he took over most of the building on the claim. He had his own way of working, faster than Neil's, more precise than Ezra, with a gift for seeing problems before they appeared. Clara watched him and felt something she had not expected to feel. Pride, yes, but also completion. The knowledge she had gathered was passing forward. The chain was unbroken. In 1897, Eli built a passage of his own for his new wife on a claim 12 miles north, using techniques that Clara had taught him and improvements he had invented himself. Clara went to see it when it was finished. She crawled through and felt the warmth, tested the flap, checked the vents. It was better than anything she had ever built. It was the future, growing out of the past. She told Eli she was proud of him. She did not tell him she was proud of herself because that was not the kind of thing you said. But she felt it anyway, standing in her son's passage, looking at what her desperate gamble had become. Clara Hensley Vale died on the 14th of April, 1919. She was 66 years old. She had lived through 39 Dakota winters, had raised 3 children to adulthood, had buried 1 husband, and outlived another. She had taught more people than she could count, and built more passages than she could remember, and she had never once stopped keeping chickens. Ezra had passed 5 years earlier, quietly, in his sleep, the way men like him passed when their work was done. Clara had mourned him the way she had mourned Neil's by building. She had added a new section to the co-op, improved the flap mechanism one more time, reinforced the frame with oak that Eli had hauled from Brookings for her. In the end, she was found in her chair by the stove, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed as if she were sleeping. The passage was still sealed for winter, even though spring had come. She had not taken it apart yet. She never laughed at small heat, even when the danger had passed. The funeral was larger than anyone expected. People came from 30 miles away, from towns Clara had never visited, from claims she had never seen. They came to pay respects to the woman who had taught their parents, their grandparents, their neighbors how to survive. They came because she had mattered in a way that few people on the frontier ever mattered, not through wealth or power or fame, but through knowledge freely given. Eli spoke at the service. He did not say much. He said that his mother had been stubborn and practical and afraid of nothing except wasting warmth. He said that she had taught him everything he knew about building. He said that the passage on her claim, the one she had rebuilt 3 times, the one that had started as a desperate gamble and become a monument, would stand as long as he had breath to maintain it. He kept that promise. By the end of the decade, more than 30 families within hauling distance of De Smet used some version of Clara's design, passages that linked coop to cabin, shed to kitchen, barn to bunkhouse. The method had spread beyond the county now, carried by travelers and relatives, and the slow accumulation of letters that passed from settlement to settlement across the northern plains. It spread because it saved what frontier households could least spare: fuel, birds, and sleep. It spread because a widow with $18 and 1.5 cords of wood had refused to die the way everyone expected her to die. Clara lived out her final years on the same prairie she had nearly lost in her first winter. The neighbors remembered her for the smell of bread, feathers, tallow smoke, and the practical kindness with which she answered foolish questions seriously. When she was gone, they did not remember the debt or the widowhood or the mockery she had endured. They remembered the winter she had refused to surrender arithmetic to fear. The black wind came on the 15th of October, 1880. The temperature fell 40 degrees before midnight. Abel Rusk, who had buried a wife and an infant and survived 9 Dakota winters, had stood in Clara's doorway and delivered his verdict. "If you cut that wall open now, Mrs. Vale, that child will freeze before morning and your birds with him." Morning came gray through drifted seams. The kettle still breathed on the stove. The boy's hand had gone warm in sleep. In the coop, 43 birds muttered on their roosts, alive. Between them, the passage sagged a little under packed snow, ugly and low and absolutely real. The thing the town had laughed at, a living hallway, had done what 6 missing cords of wood and all the right advice could not. It had let one poor cabin and one poor coop keep each other alive until daybreak. Clara opened the flap with 2 fingers and watched the hen's breath roll softly through the dim passage like smoke that had chosen not to leave.